When you've been working, have you ever come across the phrase, maybe you've used it yourself, I'm not going to ask you to do anything I wouldn't do myself? You ever come across that? What are they saying when someone says something like that? I think they're saying, I respect you. I'm not going to abuse your trust. And I'm here, I'm in the trenches with you. Okay, I'm working alongside you. It's kind of like a brothers in arms kind of thing to say. And I think, generally speaking, it's good management to say something like that because it builds rapport with the team. It builds trust between the manager and the team. And let's face it, who wants a bad boss? No one wants a bad boss. You just think about how much bad management can affect your life. It can be quite profound, can't it? It can lead to all kinds of stress. It can affect your daily life and how much you feel like you enjoy your life to have a bad boss. And we can have bad bosses either through bad character. You could have a bad boss who's not got the right kind of character for their role, or they could just be, they lack the competency and the skill set and the experience to do their job. And I'm not actually sure which is worse. You could have a boss who's a really nice person. You love them. They're really great to be around, but they're actually just a bit lousy at their job and they don't really know what they're doing. Or you could have a boss who's great at their job. They bring in the results all the time. They achieve loads of things, but actually they're slightly horrible. Perhaps they're distant, overbearing. They're impossible to please. I don't know which is worse, really. But what about the big boss, the boss of the world? What do we, as his subordinates, think of him? What do we think of his performance? What would we give him were we to write a 360 review? I think the cultural opinion outside the church is that God is a bit aloof, perhaps, inaccessible. Maybe he's sometimes harsh, unpredictable. Perhaps God is a bit of a killjoy. I think those perhaps are the descriptions that you might get from popular opinion. And you may even hear question marks against God's character. If he's powerful, then what about suffering and pain? Does that mean he's not good? Perhaps he's good, but not all powerful. Perhaps he's not the kind of boss who would say something like, I'm not going to ask you to do anything that I wouldn't do myself. That he just looks down on us from his throne and demands these great things from us. What do we think of him as Christians? I think sometimes it can be tempting to think that God isn't a good boss. Sometimes we can believe this subconsciously. And it has surprisingly widespread implications for us and for our spiritual life. If you doubt God's goodness for you, if you doubt his ability to be a great boss and also to have the character to match it, it can become, I have to read my Bible. I have to go to church. I have to love difficult people. I have to pray. I have to share Jesus with others. And that list could just go on and on and on, going through our minds. And it becomes miserable, doesn't it? If we're not careful, certainly if you feel like God is a bad boss, that he's distant and cold, disinterested in your life, sat in his shiny corner office, concerned with only the really important things, generally displeased with your efforts, never quite secure in how he thinks of you, not interested in little old me, then you'll grow to resent God and everything about church life. It will all become duty. It will all become dry. It will all become draining. The passage that we're going to look at today, we're going to see that in the biggest project, if you like, that the universe has, God wouldn't ask us to do something that he hasn't already done. In fact, you could say he invented the whole notion. We're in the middle of a sermon series where we're looking at Old Testament passages and finding ways in which they point to Jesus. And We've got the assignment of looking at Genesis 22 today, a very famous story in the Old Testament of Abraham and Isaac. If you want to turn to that chapter, Genesis 22, I'll read on from there. I need to find it. Genesis 22. After these things, right, what are these things? So I'd say after Jesus, Abraham might be one of the most important figures in the Bible for getting an understanding of how God relates to his creation. So after these things refers to all of the events leading up into this moment between God and Abraham. So in chapter 12 of Genesis, we see God calling Abraham, as he's known then, to leave home, to go to a new place that God will show him. God is going to make him into a great nation. He's going to bless him. He's going to make Abraham's name great. In chapter 15, we see God establishing a covenant with Abraham. Even though he's childless, he's going to turn him into this great nation. So he reaffirms his commitment to Abraham and even says that his children, his offspring, will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. But Abraham's wife, Sarah, she's barren. And in desperation and doubt, Abraham conceives a child of Hagar, who's his servant. Abraham takes this into his own hands, the situation, and it doesn't end well. But because God is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, he maintains his covenant with Abraham. He upgrades his name to Abraham and again gives him another promise that soon Sarah will bear a son and his name shall be Isaac. Isaac is born. Then we get to chapter 22, which is the climax, really, of this whole storyline between God and Abraham. So that's what those things were. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Strange, isn't it? Given everything I've just unpacked, all these promises, Isaac was meant to be the fulfillment of all these promises and the start of this great nation. Why is God asking him to sacrifice his firstborn? We'll find out. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. He took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn." Now, there's no greater authority than anyone can swear anything. "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Right. But I think there's a few things that we probably just want to unpack with this before we go any further. The first is to recognize that God tests. He doesn't tempt us, but God tests. It's not unknown for God to test individuals in the Bible. And that's not the same as tempting. God does not tempt evil, but he tests our commitment. Perhaps this is something you've experienced yourself. Secondly, Abraham represents the kind of faith that God is looking for. That even though he's put to the test, he responds with complete trust, remarkable trust. Especially when you look at the fact that the death of Isaac completely appears to contradict God's promise. But look at Abraham's behavior. He rose early the next day, so there was no delay, no second thoughts. He says to his servants, "The boy and I will come back to you." So even though he's committed to this act of sacrifice, Abraham still plans that both of them will return. And then to his son, he says, "God will provide himself a burnt offering, my son." Later on, we read in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, that Abraham really did believe that God could bring Isaac back to life. And we see in the outcome, don't we? It's clear that God never intended for this to be fulfilled, showing us that Abraham's faith was not misplaced. The third thing that this shows us, just as we're zooming in on this little section, is that it introduces the idea of substitution. This whole sacrificial system that will be developed throughout the Old Testament, enshrined into law, but it's only a short-term fix. It becomes exhausting for God's people, constantly undertaking these rituals that are costly, inconvenient. They have to be followed so carefully, and it's never enough. They have to go on and on and on, these sacrifices. But here we see a seed of the idea that the only way to cleanse ourselves from our sin is to transfer it to something else, and for it to die in our place. The idea of a substitution is planted. Fourthly, Jesus, as we can see, it's fairly obvious in this text, Jesus is our sacrificial lamb. So it's believed that the land of Moriah, where God called Abraham to go and sacrifice his son, is actually where Jerusalem would be built later on. It takes 2 days to travel, signifying some kind of important third day. And this is why John the Baptist, in the first few chapters of the Gospel of John, says, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." He says, saying that to an audience who understands the ancient sacrificial system. So all of this points forward to a day when Jesus would offer himself as a substitute, as the perfect and final sacrifice, to deal with our guilt. All of our past guilt, our present guilt, and our future guilt will be transferred to Jesus, giving us the opportunity to take on a new nature. This is obviously where Jesus is promised in God's divine oath to Abraham. He says, "I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed." So out of Abraham's offspring, there will be someone who rises up, defeats evil, mediates a blessing to all the nations. So it's a pretty important text. Tim Keller, who sadly passed away at the end of last week, summarizes this whole section like this. He says that Jesus is the true and better Abraham who answered the call of God to leave all the comfortable and familiar and go into the void, not knowing where he went. But Jesus is also the true and better Isaac, who was not just offered up by his father on the mount, but was truly sacrificed for us all. While God said to Abraham, "Now I know you love me, because you did not withhold your son, your only son whom you love, from me." Now we, at the foot of the cross, can say to God, "Now I know that you love me, because you did not withhold your son, whom you love, from me." It's a pretty profound way to express his love for us, isn't it? So is God the kind of person who would say, "I'm never going to ask you to do something I wouldn't do myself"? Well, conclusively, no, he's not. Now, we see that as I started off by talking about that as an idea of good management, but the truth is God is better than just a good manager or a good boss. You think about it, bosses are human, aren't they? You may have the best boss in the world, who's the most gifted and compelling leader, but ultimately they'll let us down at some point. No matter how good their intentions are, our bosses are limited in their power and their influence. Perhaps you yourself are a boss, have been a boss in the past, and you are keenly aware of the limits of your power and influence. But God is a great boss, and this passage shows us that he is both able to deliver on all of his promises, and he has both the good intentions and competency. Let me give you an illustration. That is a crude, hopefully you can see that. That's a crude picture of a letter N. Every other hierarchy that we ever experience in life, including all other religions, follow an N-shaped relationship. All of the human-to-human relationships you have, every other hierarchical structure follows an N shape. We do something for God or the person that's higher up, they respond and do something for us. We ascend to them, it or they, and it and they reciprocate. It's more of a contract, isn't it, than a covenant. We see this in the workplace, we see this everywhere. It maintains social order, this idea of reciprocity, but not so with the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible and our relationship and our dynamic with him follows a U-shaped dynamic. It subverts everything we know about hierarchies. God initiates, stoops down to us, and only then are we encouraged to do something for him. He condescends to our level. He makes a commitment to us. Before we've done anything for him, he makes promises to us and fulfills them. This is so important for us to understand, because God will never ask us to do something without first establishing a covenant of love and peace and ongoing provision for us. This is what we see in his relationship with Abraham. When we understand this deep down, not just as head knowledge, but when we understand this in our hearts, it melts any kind of hardness we have towards him. It woos us into glad submission to God. It wins our affections for him. It earns our loyalty. God is not aggressive or manipulative. It's his kindness that is meant to lead us to repentance. We have a great boss in God. And this turns everything upside down, doesn't it? It turns everything that ever feels dutiful, dry, or draining about our spiritual lives into something that is a delight. So it becomes, instead of, I have to read my Bible, it turns into, I get to encounter God through his word. Instead of, oh, I have to go to church, it becomes, I get to worship the living God together with my new church family. Instead of having to love difficult people, it becomes, I get to show people the love of this great Jesus. Instead of having to pray, having to spend time doing quiet time, it becomes, I get to talk with my Creator who loves me, always listens to me, and encourages me to approach him with all of my concerns and troubles. Instead of, I have to share Jesus with others, it becomes, I get to tell people about the answer to their deepest problems and see them set free, truly free. God is for us and not against us. This, compared to this, makes a world of difference in our lives. God takes the initiative. God serves us first. It's hard to believe, isn't it? But nothing really encapsulates this more than when we see Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. Remember in the Last Supper, Jesus, one by one, is washing the disciples' feet in this overt act of service. Just think how dirty their feet would have been, treading through the streets in their sandals, passing through livestock probably. Just imagine. But then Peter interrupts, doesn't he? In John 13, when it comes to Peter's turn, Peter says, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replies, you do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. But Jesus answers, unless I wash you, you have no part in me. Just see what that means. Unless we let Jesus serve us, we remain outside of his kingdom. We've missed the point of what Jesus is about. We don't understand him or anything he says. And we take on ourselves a life of exhaustion and stress. I can sympathize with Peter's response because surely in our N-shaped existence, it's our duty to serve the higher ups, isn't it? That's the social hierarchy. That's the social contract. But not with Jesus. Jesus is a disruptor of that social contract. He establishes a U-shaped dynamic. Even though he's the King of Kings, he came to serve and not be served. That summarizes the entire relationship between God and us. Where else do we see this kind of lavish love, this kind of service? The Creator serving the creation. This is incredible grace and mercy.